Okay, that was a big carrot. My name is Ian Murphy, and today I'll be reading to you A History of Central Banking by Stephen Goodson. We've reached chapter 2, so let's begin. Chapter 2 The Hidden Origins of the Bank of England. Quote, all great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world would be astonished. End quote. Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Ancient England. King Offa ruled the kingdom of Mercia, which was bounded by the rivers of Trent and Mersey in the north, the Thames Valley in the south, Wales in the west, and East Anglia and Essex in the east, from 757 to 791 AD. It was one of the 7 autonomous kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy. Offa was a wise and able administrator and a kind-hearted leader. He established the first monetary system in England. On account of the scarcity of gold, he used silver for coinage and as a store of wealth. The standard unit of exchange was a pound of silver, divided into 240 pennies. The pennies were stamped with a star, Old English staria, from which the word sterling is derived. In 787, King Offa introduced a statute prohibiting usury, viz., the charging of interest on money lent, a concept which dates back to the pagan era. The laws against usury were further entrenched by King Alfred from 865 through 99, who directed that the property of the usurers be forfeited, while in 1050 Edward the Confessor from 1042 to 66 decreed not only forfeiture, but that a usurer be declared an outlaw and be banished for life. First Jewish migration and expulsion. The moneylenders, most of whom were Jewish law, unlike Catholicism and Islam, permitted the charging of interest on loans to persons who were not Jewish. First arrived in England in 1066 in the wake of William I's defeat of King Harold II at Hastings on October 14th. Although the historical record does not indicate whether they promoted the idea of a military invasion of England, these moneylenders had at the very least financed it. For their support of William, they were richly rewarded by being allowed to practice usury under royal protection. The consequences for the English people were disastrous. By charging rates of interest of 33% per annum on lands mortgaged by nobles and 300% per annum on tools of trade or chattels pledged by workmen within 2 generations, 1/4 of all English lands were in the hands of usurers. At his death in 1186, Aaron of Lincoln, the English financier, was declared to be the richest man in England, and it was estimated that his wealth exceeded that of King Henry II. Furthermore, the moneylenders undermined the ethos of the guilds and exasperated the English merchants by selling a large variety of goods under one roof. The famous economist Dr. William Cunningham compares, quote, the activity of the moneylenders in England from the 11th century onward to a sponge, which sucks up all the wealth of the land and thereby hinders all economic development. End quote. By the beginning of the 13th century, many nobles were in danger of losing their lands through usury and taxation. In 1207, an enormous sum of, we'll say, $60,000, not really, I don't know what that symbol is, was levied in taxes on the English population. Nobles who borrowed from the moneylenders and from the king and his agents had to have their mortgages registered on the treasury rolls. As soon as a noble got into financial difficulty, the king would buy the debt from the moneylenders and seize the land for himself. In 1215, the nobles revolted and forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. On June 15th, 1215, this document consists of 61 clauses relating to the establishment of various constitutional and legal rights. But its principal purpose was to cancel the bonds of the moneylenders and to abolish usury. On October 19th, 1216, King John died and was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Henry III, who ruled from 1219 to 1272. His reign was little better than that of his father, and 19 of the clauses affecting the role of the moneylenders were abrogated the following year. However, his heir, Edward I, from 1272 through 1307, soon realized that if he did not take action against the moneylenders, he would be in danger of losing his throne. In 1233 and 1275, statutes were passed which abolished all forms of usury. A further statute was passed by King Edward on July 18, 1290, compelling the entire Jewish population of 16,511 to leave England forever. One of over 100 expulsions of the Jews which have been recorded throughout European history. Unlike the modern practice of ethnic cleansing, the Jews, after paying a tax of 1/15 of the value of their movables and 1/10 of their specie, were permitted to leave England with all their goods and chattels. The glorious Middle Ages. With the banishment of the moneylenders and the abolition of usury, taxes were moderate and there was no state debt, as the interest-free tally stick was used for government expenditures. This ancient instrument of finance, known to the Saracens and possibly also to the Chinese, is derived from the Latin word talia, meaning a stick. A tally stick was made out of hazel, willow, or boxwood. Because these woods split easily, they were usually 8 inches in length, from the forefinger to the thumb, 20.3 centimeters, and half an inch, 1.3 centimeters wide, although they could be up to 8 feet or 2.44 millimeters long. The denominations were indicated by different sized cuts in the wood. $1,000 were marked by cutting out the thickness of the palm of hand, $100 by breadth of the little finger, and $1 that of a swelling barley corn. Shillings, somewhat less, and pence were marked by incisions. I just want to pause here. When I say dollars, I meant pounds. All right. So the payee was recorded on the flat sides. When all the details had been recorded on the tally, it was split nearly to the bottom, so that one parted retained a stump or handle, on which a hole would be bored. This was known as the counter tally or counterfoil, and was held on a rod at the exchequer. The flat strip without the stump was given to the payee, as no two pieces of wood are identical. It was impossible to forge a tally stick. The tally sticks were first introduced during the reign of King Henry II, 1100 through 35, and would remain in circulation until 1783. It was, however, during the period 1290 through 1485 that tallies would reach their apogee and constitute the principal means of state finance. Tallies were used not only to pay state salaries, but to finance major items of infrastructure, such as construction of the wall of the City of London, public buildings and ports. The exact amount of tallies in circulation is not known, but as late as 1694, 17 million worth of pounds were still in existence. This was a prodigious sum, as the king's annual budget rarely exceeded 2.5 million pounds, and a laborer earned a penny a day. With tolerable taxes, no state debt, and no interest to pay, England enjoyed a period of unparalleled growth and prosperity. The average laborer worked only 14 weeks and enjoyed 160 to 180 days holiday. According to Lord William Leverhulme, a writer of that time, quote, The men of the 15th century were very well paid. End quote. In fact, so well paid that the purchasing power of their wages and their standard living would only be exceeded in the late 19th century. A laborer could provide for all the necessities his family required. They were well clothed in good woolen cloth and had plenty of meat and bread. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Anglo-German philosopher, confirms these living conditions in his The Foundations of the 19th Century. Quote, in the 13th century, when the Teutonic races began to build their new world, the agriculturalist over nearly the whole of Europe was a freer man, with a more assured existence than he is today. Copyhold was the rule, so that England, for example, today a seat of landlordship, was even in the 15th century almost entirely in the hands of thousands of farmers, who were not only legal owners of their land, but possessed in addition far-reaching free rights to common pastures and woodlands. End quote. During their spare hours, many craftsmen volunteered their skills in building some of England's magnificent cathedrals, which reinforces one of the basic tenets of Western civilization, that without leisure time, the fostering of culture is not possible. George Macaulay Trevelyan, the English social historian, describes these accomplishments as follows, quote, the continuous but ever-moving tradition of ecclesiastical architecture still processed on its majestic way, filling England with towering forests of masonry, of which the beauty and grandeur have never been rivaled, either by the ancients or the moderns. In the newer churches, the light no longer crept, but flooded in, through the stained glass, of which the secret is today even more completely lost than the magic of the architecture. End quote. Although King Henry VIII, from 1509 through 47, relaxed the laws regarding usury in 1509, they were subsequently repealed by his son, King Edward VI, from 1547 through 53, by an act of 1552, whose preamble stated that, quote, usury is by word of God utterly prohibited as a vice most odious and detestable. End quote. The end of a golden era. During the 17th century, this golden era came to a tragic end. Large numbers of moneylenders who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 by Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon settled in Holland. Although the Dutch were at the time an important maritime power, the usurers based in Amsterdam desired to return to England, where their prospects for expanding the operations of their money-lending empire were far more promising. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 through 1603, small numbers of Maronese Spanish Jews who had converted to Christianity settled in London. Some of them practiced as goldsmiths, accepting deposits of gold for safekeeping, and then issuing up to 10 times the amount of gold received as gold receipts, that is, loans with interest. These receipts became accepted as a form of currency and a forerunner of the fraudulent fractional reserve system of banking, were initially lent to the crown or treasury at 8% per annum. But according to Samuel Pepys, the diarist and secretary to the Admiralty, the interest rate increased to as much as 20% and even 30% per annum. The rate of interest merchants paid often exceeded 33% per annum, even though the legal rate was only 6% per annum. Workmen and poor people bore the brunt of these extortionate rates of interest by having to pay 60, 70, or even 80% per annum. Cromwell and the English Civil War. In 1534, by the Act of Supremacy, the Church of England was established as the official religion of England by King Henry VIII. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Puritan beliefs based on the teachings of John Wycliffe and John Calvin gained an increasing number of adherents. The Puritans considered the Bible to be the true law of God and emphasized Bible reading, prayer, and preaching, and the simplification of the ritual of the sacraments. The Stuart king Charles I from 1625 through 49, who wished to maintain the preeminence of the Anglican Church, came into intensified conflict with the Puritans, who were making great progress in proselytizing the population. After the assassination of Charles's trusted friend and advisor, the Duke of Buckingham, in 1628, he gradually became more isolated. The growing religious division provided a perfect opportunity for exploitation by the conspirators, as Israel D. Israel, the father of Prime Minister Benjamin D. Disraeli, wrote in The Life and Reign of Charles I, quote, "The nation was artfully divided into Sabbatarians and Sabbath breakers." End quote. Civil war soon followed between the Royalists, Anglicans, and Roundheads, Puritans, and lasted from 1642 through 48. The Roundheads, with their new model army, were victorious, and an esteemed 190,000 persons, or 3.8% of the population, died. The leader of the Roundheads was Oliver Cromwell, from 1599 through 1658, whose new model army was not only outfitted and provisioned by the chief contractor and professional agitator Ferdinand Carvajal, but also bankrolled by moneylenders in Amsterdam. The leader of the Dutch Jews, Manasseh ben Israel, sent petitions to Cromwell asking that the Jews be allowed to immigrate to England in return for their financial favors, which he had arranged. The regicide of King Charles I. The treachery to which Cromwell descended is revealed in correspondence between himself and a moneylender named Ebenezer Pratt in Germany. Quote, June 16, 1647, from Oliver Cromwell to Ebenezer Pratt. In return for financial support, will advocate admission of Jews to England. This, however, impossible while Charles living. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which do not at present exist. Therefore, advise that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. End quote. King Charles was staying as a virtual prisoner in Holmby House, North Hampshire, on June 4th, 1647. 500 revolutionaries seized the king, but then allowed him to escape to the Isle of Wight, where he was subsequently arrested. On December 5th, 1648, the House of Commons decided, quote, that the king's concessions were satisfactory to a settlement. End quote. Cromwell then purged the House of Commons with the assistance of colonial pride until there was only a rump of 50 members left, who then duly voted that the king be put on trial. Not a single English lawyer was prepared to draw up a charge sheet against the king. Eventually, it was provided by a Dutch lawyer, Isaac Dorislaw. The king was forced to participate in a show trial in a high court of justice in which 2/3 of its members were levelers from the army. Charles refused to plead, but was found guilty and executed on January 30th, 1649. As the procession approached the scaffold, large numbers of the crowd shouted, quote, "God save the king!" End quote. After the deed had been done, there was an enormous groan of anguish. Oliver Cromwell died on September 3rd, 1658, and was succeeded by his son, Richard, who ruled for 9 months. Charles I's son, Charles II, from 1616 through 85, succeeded his executed father, although he would be the last English monarch to issue money, banknotes. In his own right, he made 2 fatal errors of governance. 1. On August 1st, 1663, he passed the euphemistically sounding Act for the Encouragement of Trade, which enabled the export of all foreign coins or bullion of gold or silver free of interdict, regulation, or duties of any kind. During the debate on the bill, the Earl of Anglesey precedently observed that, quote, "it is dangerous to the peace of the kingdom which it shall be in the power of half a dozen or half a score of rich, discontented, or facetious persons to make a bank, an accumulation of our own coin and bullion beyond the seas, and leave us in want of money, when it shall not no longer be in the king's power to prevent it. End quote. Number 2. 3 years later, by means of an act for the encouragement of coinage, he permitted private persons, i.e. bankers, and goldsmiths to mint the coins of the realm at the royal mint, and thereby acquire the considerable benefit of the seigniorage, the difference between the face value of coins and their production costs, income for their own private account. Furthermore, it enabled them to increase or diminish the supply of money in circulation and to raise or lower prices at will to the great detriment of the general population. His brother James II, 1685 through 88, reigned only lasted 3 years. He was a victim of unscrupulous pamphletry and propaganda, which emanated mainly from Holland. A military expedition undertaken by Prince William of Orange eventually dethroned him. Although James's army was numerically superior, he was discouraged from attacking after John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, suddenly deserted him. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, Churchill subsequently received an annual stipend of £6,000 from the Dutch merchant Solomon de Medina. In payment for his treacherous conduct, these vast sums of blood money enabled Churchill to proceed with the construction of Blenheim Palace, which was completed at his death in 1722. In 1700, Solomon de Medina became the first Jew to receive a knighthood for his services to the crown. William of Orange's military campaign, like that of the other William the Conqueror in 1066, was financed by his bankers. In return for their support, William III, from 1689 through 1702, would surrender the royal prerogative of issuing England's money free of debt and interest to a consortium known as the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. A.N. Field, in All These Things, summarizes these epochal events known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but which was in effect the infamous revolution as follows. Quote, William of Orange arrived from Amsterdam, surrounded by a whole swarm of Dutch money-lenders. Driving his royal father-in-law, James II, out of the kingdom, he graciously consented to ascend the throne of Britain. A very natural result following on this event was the inauguration of the national debt by the establishment 6 years later of the Bank of England for the purpose of lending money to the crown. Britain had paid her way as she went until the bankers arrived. The pawn shop was then opened, and the resulting situation in which the nation finds itself today could not be better described than in the words put by Shakespeare with prophetic vision in the mouth of the dying John of Gaunt. Quote, This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement of or petlinged farm, England bound, and with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shores beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds, that England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. End quote. Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1. Establishment of the Bank of England. The need for a privately owned central bank was fronted by a retired pirate, William Paterson, when he wrote a pamphlet in 1693 entitled A Brief Account of the Intended Bank of England. He would later boast that this bank, quote, hath the benefit of interest on all monies which it created out of nothing, end quote. On Thursday, June 21st, 1694, subscription lists for the bank, which had a capital of £1.2 million, were opened. By the following Monday, this amount had been fully subscribed. The ostensible purpose of the bank was to lend King William unlimited sums at 8% per annum to enable the prosecution of war, and in particular the conflict against Louis XIV of France, whose country was not on the usury system. The bank would thus receive from the Crown of interest of £100,000 per annum, the addition of £4,000 being an administrative fee. The bank also acquired the right to issue £1.2 million in banknotes without any cold cover. Prior to its listing, the bylaws of the bank were carefully scrutinized by Sergeant at Law Cecil Levins in order to ensure that the bank complied with its hidden purpose, viz. To fleece the English people in perpetuity by allowing the creation of the nation's money and means of exchange out of nothing at interest. All this fake money was to be accompanied by compounding interest. There was much opposition to the establishment of the bank, foremost with the goldsmiths and moneylenders, who correctly foresaw that it would bring an end to their usurious racket of fractional reserve banking based on their gold receipts. Landowners and country gentry feared an escalation in interest rates as the bank would control their nation's money supply. There were allegations that the bank would favor certain merchants with low rates of interest. The biggest fear was that the bank would grow too powerful and would become the keystone of the commercial world. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened, as the Bank of England became the model on which all subsequent central banks were replicated. At that time, the House of Commons had 514 members, consisting of 243 Tories, 241 Whigs, and 28 members whose allegiance was unknown. About 2/3 of the members were country gentlemen, and it is believed that of the 514 members, approximately 20% were illiterate. The bill was debated in July 1694, the high point in summer, when most of the rural members were engaged in summer pursuits and the harvesting of their crops. On that fateful Friday, July 27th, 1694, when the Charter of Incorporation was granted, only 42 members were present, all of them Whigs, as the Tories opposed the bill, who all voted in favor of it. This begs the question as to what a quorum consisted of in those days. The title of the bill made no mention of the proposed Bank of England, which is only described, or one might say, secreted, 2/3 down in the unintelligible verbiage to the layman that is of the bill. The opening sentence of the bill reads as follows, quote, William and Mary, by the grace of God, King and Queen of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defenders of the faith, etc., to all for whom these presents shall come greeting. End quote. The third sentence, which contains 242 words, starts, quote, Whereas in and by a certain act lately made in Parliament, entitled an Act for granting to their Majesties several rates and duties upon tonnage of ships and vessels, and upon beer, ale, and other liquors, for securing certain recompenses and advantages in the said act mentioned, to such persons as shall voluntarily advance the sum of £1,500,000 towards carrying on the war with France, it is amongst other things enacted. End quote. The gist of the first 2/3 of the bill details the necessity to levy a complicated array of new rates, duties, and taxes on ships, beer, ale, and other liquors. The true purpose of these taxes was that they were needed in order to fund the interest of all future government loans. Shortly thereafter, further taxes were introduced, including a land tax, paper tax, poll tax, salt tax, stamp tax, and window tax, which replaced the hearth or chimney tax. Other taxes initiated were a tax on peddlers, a tax on hackney coaches, a tax on births, marriages, and deaths, and lastly, a tax on bachelors. However, the most punitive tax introduced was an income tax levied at a rate of 20%. It was applied not only to companies, but laborers too. war and debt, slavery in perpetuity. Henceforth, a pattern would emerge where unnecessary wars would be embarked upon, which simultaneously increased the national debt and the profits of the usurers. Significantly, most of these wars were started against countries that had implemented interest-free state banking systems, as was the case in the North American colonies and France under Napoleon. This pattern of attacking and enforcing the bankers' system of usury has been deployed widely in the modern era and includes the defeats of Imperial Russia in World War I, Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II, and most recently, Libya in 2011. These were all countries which had state banking systems which distributed their wealth of their respective nations on an equitable basis and provided their populations with a standard of living far superior to that of their rivals and contemporaries. Within 2 years of its establishment in 1696, the Bank of England had £1.7 million worth of banknotes circulating with a gold reserve of only 2% or £36,000. On May 1, 1707, the union between Scotland and England was established, motivated in no small way by the necessity to seize control of the Royal Mint in Edinburgh, which took place in 1709. By 1720, after the conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 through 14, the national debt had risen to £30 million, with the war itself having cost £50 million. After the American War of Independence, 1775 through 83, which had been fought after the colonists had been forced to replace their debt and largely interest-free colonial scrip with English money and had resulted in 50% unemployment, the national debt soared to £176 million. According to Sir John Harold Chapman, who wrote The Bank of England, a history 1694 through 1914, in 1944, Solomon de Medina and two da Costas, Fonseca Henriquez, Mendez, Nunes, Rodriguez, Salvador, and Teixeira de Matos had acquired the majority of the bank's shares by 1722. In 1786, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger tried to abolish the national debt with a sinking fund which generated interest of £1 million per annum to repay the debt. This scheme was soon abandoned because of the enormous increase in loans incurred to finance the war against Napoleon. In 1797, in order to pay for the burgeoning interest burden, a system of graduated income tax had to be introduced, which by 1815 was yielding £70 million per annum. The war against France lasted from 1792 until 1815. Among the principal objectives of this pointless bloodletting was to destroy Napoleon's debt and interest-free system of finance. During this period, England also waged a war against the United States from 1812 until 1814. This war, as was the case with the war against France, was instigated by England at the behest of banker Mayer Amschel Rothschild. After the United States Congress refused to renew the charter of the Rothschild-controlled Bank of the United States, which had been the Central Bank of America from 1791 until 1811. Mayer Amschel Rothschild is famously credited with having said, quote, "Give me control of the economics of a country, and I care not who makes her laws. The few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class." End quote. British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval from 1809 through 12 tried to stop this completely futile war, but was assassinated on May 11, 1812, in the lobby of the House of Commons by John Bellingham, a political radical who had been set up by the Rothschild. By 1815, the national debt had ballooned to £885 million. This completely unnecessary war resulted in approximately 3 million military personnel and at least 1 million civilians losing their lives. In order to destroy Napoleon's state bank, it cost the deluded British public a staggering £831 million, of which over £2.5 billion were still outstanding in 1914. The principal of £504 million had over the intervening period increased fivefold as a result of the compounding effect of interest. An astute agrarian and parliamentarian, William Cobbett, 1763 through 1835, at that time perceived what was afoot and wrote as follows. One second. Quote, I set to read the Act of Parliament by which the Bank of England was created. The investors knew what they were about. Their design was to mortgage by degrees the whole country, lands, houses, property, labor. The scheme has produced what the world never saw before. Starvation in the midst of abundance. End quote. In 1800, a member of Parliament, Sir William Pulteney, proposed the formation of a national bank after having made, quote, vigorous attacks, end quote, against the bank. In 1824, another member of Parliament, David Ricardo, submitted a detailed plan to convert the Bank of England into a national bank. Both attempts failed. The affairs of the Bank of England remained secret, and it was not until 1833, 139 years later, that a sanitized version of its accounts was presented to Parliament by means of the Act of 1833. At the start of World War I in 1914, the national debt stood at £650 million. On March 31st, 1919, it had increased to £7.4 billion, of which £3 billion is still outstanding after 95 years at an interest rate of 3.5% per annum. In 1919, budget 40% of the expenditure was allocated to the payment of interest. In World War II, the national debt rose by almost 300%, from £7.1 billion in 1939 to £20.1 billion in 1945. As at March 2017, it stands at over £1.8 trillion. However, if one includes all liabilities, including state and public pensions, it exceeds £5 trillion. Nationalization. On February 14th, 1946, the Labour government nationalized the Bank of England. The shareholders received treasury notes to the value of £11 million, which were redeemable after 20 years. This nationalization, which supposedly placed the bank under public control, did not introduce any change to the privately run system of fractional reserve banking and was undertaken purely for propaganda purposes as part of the Labour Party's nationalization program of certain financial and industrial concerns. On April 6, 1974, the Bank of England established the Bank of England Nominee Limited, company registration number 1307478, a wholly owned subsidiary with private shareholders holding its £101 shares, of which 50% were sold. There is a suspicion that this rearrangement of the bank's affairs represents a reverse takeover of it by private shareholders, in view of the fact that certain aspects of the Bank of England's operations are protected by its Royal Charter, Section 27(9) of the Companies Act of 1976 and the Official Secrets Act of 1989, and are therefore not subject to public and parliamentary scrutiny. There may well be substance to this allegation. Alright, so that was chapter 2. I'll see you guys all in the next video. Take care.